So welcome again, Dr. Amanda Aguilera, someone that I really admire and respect, a leading voice on power and power dynamics in the world that's desperately needed. She's the executive director at the Right Use of Power Institute and recently published a book called Shaping Power for Good, Wayfinding to Right Relationship. I could dig into lots of Amanda's past, but she comes to this space. She's a psychologist by training, as well as a restorative justice practitioner, and a bunch of diverse experiences within that. So I won't try and do a bio justice. I'm probably just going to pass it right over to you, Dr. Aguilera, and let you go.
Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate you inviting me into the space. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. Just want to say, feel free to have your cameras on or off. Of course, I like to see your beautiful human faces. But I want to give an opportunity first to just see, and you can raise your actual hand or virtual hand. How many of you have taken right use of power training or have any familiarity with kind of the framework? We got a few in the house. A little bit of, yep, great. And I would love to invite you in the chat to just name kind of what has your attention about power right now. What is on your mind in terms of power these days? And you can just throw those in the chat while I share my screen. I'm going to just give an overview so we're all on the same page. Because in the right use of power model, we kind of view power a little bit differently than you might commonly understand it. Yeah, and I see Eileen, yep, collective power in community and solidarity, power within spiritual communities. That's a huge one. Yeah, thank you for that. You can continue to put those in there. So I'm going to share my screen and we're just going to start with what is power? What is the definition of power? And this is kind of a really important starting place because a lot of us have preconceived kind of associations with power, and starting with the definition, which you can actually find in most dictionaries, is really just the ability to have an effect or influence. And I say just, but that's actually what makes the world go round, right? Our sense of agency and how we can show up and have choice and the ability to have any kind of impact, effect, or influence in the world. And so starting from this neutral definition, then we can move forward and understand that, oh yeah, power actually gets expressed and participated in a lot of different ways that has a lot of different kinds of impacts. So Bertrand Russell has this quote, the fundamental concept in social science is power, in the same sense in which energy is the fundamental concept in physics. The reason I love this quote so much is one, it points to a couple of things. One is that it's pointing to power is not something that is only experienced by some and not others. Power is actually fundamental to all relationships. It's a dynamic that's present in every relationship. Similar to energy, right? Energy, we all know exists. We may not be able to point to it very well, but we know that it's always there. It's present in everything, right? So starting to shift our understanding of power and really starting to challenge some of our preconceived ideas about what power is. And one of the things I like to point to first and foremost is that most of us view power as something you possess. Like these people have power, these people don't have power. And one of the challenges with thinking of it that way is that one is when we think about power as an object or a commodity, then we actually show up in power very differently. One of my favorite books is All About Love by Bell Hooks. And she talks about love as a noun versus love as a verb. And when you understand love as a verb, you show up in it very differently. It's active. It's something that you're doing, that you're showing up in. Whereas love as a noun is possessive. And If any of you know if you remember about economics class, what makes a commodity valuable? Does anyone remember? What makes a commodity valuable? Scarcity, right? So when we show up in scarcity, there's actually a lot of research that's been done around this. When we show up in scarcity, we actually show up in very particular ways. We tend to be very self-serving. We tend to only think about our own stuff. We hoard. We don't want to share. We feel like it's something that is, wow. I'm recovering from a cold, y'all, so my brain is moving a little more slowly today. It's something that's limited, that's only available to a few. And so, who benefits from the understanding that these people have power and these people don't have power? The people who believe that they don't have power, are they likely to use the power that they do have access to? In my mind, the answer is no, right? So the people who benefit from the understanding that some people have power and some people don't are typically the people that believe that they have power. Um, so these are some of the differences and some of the ways that I start to challenge how power is understood. There's much more in the book, but I wanted to just highlight these very kind of fundamental things that really influence how we show up in power. So I want to cover just a few of the types of power, and it's important to understand that power is not one singular thing. It actually has many different types and manifestations. And so the very first one that we teach about in Right Use of Power is personal power. It's our individual ability to have an effect or influence. It's the power that we're born with. If you think about a little baby, we think that, oh, babies are quite vulnerable and powerless. But then that baby cries, right? And has an effect or influence in order to get its needs met, right? So we're born with this ability to have an effect or influence, but because of the structures and socialization that we have over time, we tend to forget that we have that personal power, even though it's always present. And we may not recognize it in the moment, or we may have more or less access to it in the moment. But personal power is actually one of the keys to navigating all the other types of power. The next two types of power are what we call interpersonal types of power. One is role power, which accompanies a position, and it's usually elected, awarded, or assigned by a system. Its purpose is to fulfill some function within a system. The other type of interpersonal power is status power, which accompanies value judgments on particular traits that human beings have. And so it's culturally conferred. So it's things like race, religion, gender, socioeconomics, language, location. There's just so many different status that gets created in the different systems that we're involved in. The next type of power is collective power. And collective power is a combination of multiple types of power, usually with multiple human beings, toward a common interest. And there's a lot of different manifestations of collective power. It could be a support group or social movement. It could also be a hate group, right? Different purpose, but and that have different outcomes, but the function of them are very similar. Systemic power is the next type of power, and you can see in this model that systemic power kind of houses all the other types of power, meaning that it influences how collectives show up, how relationships manifest, and how we show up within relationships, how we understand our own personal power, and how we access our personal power in certain moments or relationships or systems. And so systemic power is typically gathered through people with role and status power and expressed through things like norms, laws, standards, things like that, institutions. And so it really has a pretty significant impact, even though we may not be aware of it in the moment for ourselves or in our relationships or how we're showing up within organizations. And then finally, the last type of power is universal power. And I'll toss a handout, types of power handout. Maybe Leah, if you could do that, we can put that in the chat for you so you have the definitions that you can take with you. Universal power is the power, it's similar to if you think about energy, right? We understand that energy is around us and in everything. Universal power is very similar. It's kind of beyond our cognitive understanding, although a lot of scientists really try to understand. And it kind of tends to cross over into the spiritual. It's the power that's always present and the power that we're either rooted in a moment or not. So I'm going to leave it there because we only have a short hour together. But I want to pause here and just say, what's the point of learning any of this? What's the point of even understanding power or talking about power or anything like that? And the point is not to talk about power for power's sake, but actually to have a framework and a language for talking about power. Because with human beings, typically, if we are unable to talk about something with nuance and complexity, it's really challenging to change the dynamics of it. So having a shared framework and language is really powerful, especially within a single system or organization or even a family, right? To be able to navigate the different nuances. The other point of learning about power is so that we can transform our relationships. If it's our ability to have an effect or influence, how we show up in every moment really matters. And if we're not aware of how we're showing up with our impact, our effect or influence, if we're not conscious of that, then it tends to maybe go in ways that we're not conscious of and maybe have impacts that we didn't intend. So when I wrote my book, I really wanted to not only explore all of these different types of power in depth and their intersections, but also to look at how do we find our way to right relationship? How do we use this understanding of power to heal our relationships, to transform our systems, to show up in relationship differently? So I want to share just briefly a definition of right relationship that I came up with. And the very first part is it's a temporary state. It's not a checkbox. It's not something that you attain and then you have it. It's something that we have to find and re-find within ourselves and with each other. The next part of the definition is that it's reached when everyone in the relationship, not just one person in the relationship, experiences an active honoring of their rooted personal power. And I say rooted personal power because there's a distinction between how our personal power gets socialized by systems and how our personal power shows up when we're rooted in something that's bigger than ourselves and bigger than systems. And this is a really key point because I think often when we look at trying to change systems, it feels so overwhelming that we kind of feel helpless or apathetic, or we don't know what to do. And so when we're rooted in something that's bigger than ourselves and bigger than systems, we know that systems aren't the biggest thing in the world, right? Even though it may seem that way, it may feel that way. So being rooted in something larger could look like your relationship with your core values, your relationship with God, with the earth, with collective consciousness, with something that's bigger, right? So that's a key piece. And in right relationship, is there space in that relationship in order for each of us to kind of root in? Is there time and space for us to actually have contact with something bigger? Can we be guided by our values? Can we be in alignment? And this is really pointing towards integrity. Is there space in the relationship for integrity? And then when there's an honest acknowledgement by all in the relationship of the other types of power at play in the relationship, because they exist, even if we don't want them to. Status power, role power, systemic power, all of those things exist and have real impact in our lives. So if we're not honestly acknowledging those at play, then there's no way for us to find right relationship together. Now, looking at this definition, how many of you feel either a little overwhelmed or like there's just no way that this ever happens? Or if it does happen, it's kind of rare. Anybody feeling that way with this definition? Yeah, it's pretty daunting. And when I was reflecting on that, I realized like when I am in those moments, those beautiful moments when I feel like, this feels like right relationship, and we both are sharing that feeling, it actually feels quite easeful, right? It doesn't feel like there's a lot of efforting involved. It feels like more of a relaxing into. So I want to do a little experiment with you to explore this kind of concept of right relationship, and then we'll take some questions. So this is a cartoon that I often use when I teach about systemic power. But for this demonstration, I want you to look at this picture and see if you see any signs of right relationship. Also, I want you to look and see, are there any obstacles present to being in right relationship? So in the chat, I invite you to just name, what are you seeing in terms of right relationship? What are the obstacles that you're seeing? The individuals are the obstacles. Yeah, so there's one guy pointing, right, at the koala. So a pointing is kind of a form of othering, right? Like this koala. And it's pointing to a single koala. Yeah, the koala's natural environment is destroyed. Yeah, Jeff, the individualizing of the koala's experience, right? So there's no looking around and being like, oh, maybe this koala is very anxious because their home is missing, right? So there's some systemic aspects here. There's also someone with a clipboard kind of indicating that they're experts that are evaluating, right? But if you notice in the picture, there's actually no one is actually relating. No one's actually looking at each other or relating in any way. It's observing from the outside and pointing the finger at one individual. This is such a beautiful picture, and I think it really illustrates a lot of the persistent problems that we experience in our world. Right? There's a feeling that it's this person's fault. It's because that person is the president, or that person is the leader, or it's this group is just, they're troublemakers, or, right, it's our tendency and need to want to blame or to displace the responsibility away from ourselves. But this fundamentally takes us out of relationship, and it's not recognizing the power dynamics at play. There's no recognition that systemic power is at play, that role power is at play, that status power is at play between animals and humans, even, right? Or the forest. So my invitation here is just to start to expand our definition of who we are. And when we understand that there's some sort of connections that we're missing, like if our home is destroyed, we're not going to be well. So if we're not also attending to the home, it doesn't matter how much therapy we get or how much social services is involved, right? In my view, when I experience right relationship, it actually arises quite naturally when there. Oops, gotta click through here. Um, it arises quite naturally when we realize the in between, when we understand the relationships, and when we understand that we're actually not separate, that how I show up impacts you, how you show up impacts me. All of our context, the land that we're on, the people that we interact with, the health of all of those factors within our context influence our own well-being, right? So transforming kind of our paradigm, which I address in the book, the different kind of systemic paradigms, actually makes everything else more available, including right relationship. So how we understand one another and the context in which we are in will naturally transform that, right? And I just put this in here too. The same thing applies to responsibility. This also naturally arises when we are in awareness of our interdependence. Normally, we think of responsibility as like, as an obligation, something that I have to do, and it feels heavy, right? But when we understand our connection, the responsibility doesn't feel as heavy. One, because we're not the only ones carrying it, right? Responsibility isn't individualized. It's the responsibility of the whole. So I want to pause here and check the time. I think we have time for a couple more slides. Is that true, Jeff? Just want to check in. Okay. So another concept I present in the book is about wayfinding, and I want to share this quote by Dr. Bayo Akomolafe, and some of you might have heard of him. And this quote kind of captures the essence of what I'm experiencing all around me right now. The times are urgent. Let us slow down. What if the way we respond to crisis is part of the crisis? And, this is one of the things that I'm apprenticing to right now. I can get swept up in the urgency and the tragedy and the immensity of it all, right? And our tendency is to want to try to solve things quickly because people are suffering. But also, when we're not slowing down in order to be connected, rooted in something larger, and also connected to ourselves and each other, then we actually are contributing to part of the crisis itself, right? In the ways that we're responding that's disconnected. So what do we do about this? And, part of the slowing down is realizing there's not a direct path. There's not a single right way. There's not a magic pill. And in fact, the ways that we do know, we also know haven't really been working. So can we try a different way? And I came across this concept of wayfinding actually by taking my children to see Moana and Moana 2, and really started to explore this. And I am not indigenous to the nautical wayfinding that is such a beautiful practice, but it inspired me to really think about wayfinding toward right relationship. And so I think of it as this kind of imperfect but fundamentally human approach to kind of orienting ourselves, really including that context, and being present to what actually is happening, not what we want it to be, not what it should be or should have been, or these people should have done this, but what is right now in all of the different ways around us, within us, between us. And from what is and being honest about what is, then we can take action. And so, wayfinding to right relationship to me means being willing to not know the way, because in right relationship, it's a moment by moment finding it and finding it again and finding it again. So, being willing to drop our preconceived, socialized way of understanding how we're supposed to be in relationship and meeting the moment. As I mentioned before, it starts with what is and also where you already are. You don't need more courses or skills necessarily, or like all the things that we think that we're supposed to be in the future in order to find it. We actually have what we need as human beings. We actually were born with power right now. And so this is starting where you already are is really important. Another is wayfinding encounters all kinds of storms. And that's a part of the process, discomfort and conflict, and ensuring that it's generative conflict, but addressing the pain and the grief and what is there includes that we're willing to be uncomfortable, that we're willing to engage in conflict. You can't do it alone. Again, in our individualized culture, and I'm guilty of this, even in kind of teaching the opposite. My socialization wants to like, I can just do it. I'm gonna pull up my bootstraps and just make it happen by myself, and we just can't. It's just, we just weren't meant to do it that way. And so if you aren't a part of a collective or a part of a community, if you're trying to do it by yourself or change a system by yourself, you won't be able to, or you will be made a martyr. It's important that we turn to community now more than ever. And then finally, this is a bold statement, but I believe you won't get lost if you're rooted in something larger. So it's that continuous checking in with, are we connected to what we say we care about? Are we connected to what we say we value? Are we connected to that something larger? Because that's the only way we're going to change systems. So that's all I got for presentation purposes. I'll toss it back over to you, Jeff.
That's all you got was quite a bit. That was a half-hour masterclass on fundamentals of power and an introduction to wayfinding. So I know I really appreciate it. For those of you who joined us late, Leah Fink is collecting any of your questions. And so now's a really good time. I've got a couple that popped for me, and I'm going to take the opportunity to ask them of Amanda. I'm going to use my role power as facilitator and host to just go ahead and ask a few questions that are on top of my mind. But if you have questions about power, what you've heard, power in general, get them over to Leah. We'll have some time for some Q&A, and we'll pull forward those questions here in a minute. So, yeah, I mean, I think the two stood out for me. And so maybe this is Amanda's choice. You get to decide which one has more energy that you want to answer. You mentioned generative conflict, which is a term that I know I probably have a notion of what that is, and there are some assumptions, but that might be worth just kind of exploring what that is, and maybe a bit of that restorative justice lens that you bring to this conversation too, I think is really valuable in navigating power, because often it's in conflict and discomfort that we misuse our power, right? I know I might search for control instead of collaboration or something, or so maybe a little bit of generative conflict discussion. The other piece is actually from our podcast that we did a week or two ago. You mentioned the tension, the balance that as people with power in a relationship, holding our responsibility and our vulnerability. And that really struck me because I think it's easy to err on one side of those or the other, and each kind of has a shadow side. So that's not even a question in there. That's just Jeff throwing stuff out to you, and you can respond to any of that or none of that.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks, Jeff. Those are both pretty central to my whole thing. I think, to know if you're in generative conflict or not, or if you're headed toward generative conflict or not, for me, the first sign is, Are you trying to determine who is right and who is wrong? If you're trying to determine who is right and who is wrong, and if you're trying to defend yourself as being right, you're headed down the wrong path. Because generative conflict is about understanding each person's perspective. Um, I don't, you can look up the blind man and the elephant story, which is a really good one, to really understand that none of us have the whole picture, right? We all have different perspectives and they all are a part of the picture. What matters is what harm was done and how can we repair it? And it might be that everyone in the relationship experienced harm. So if we're collapsing into right or wrong or victim and offender, it can go down more destructive paths. The responsibilities and vulnerabilities are just one of the fundamental keys to understanding power dynamics. I spend a lot of time on it in the book, and we spend a lot of time on it in the trainings. The balance or the tension or the exploration of vulnerabilities and responsibilities or the lack thereof will determine kind of how power dynamics play out. And so if, for example, you're only looking at responsibilities and vulnerability is not allowed to be present, that's something to look at and usually causes some misuses. If you are, if you have a lot of responsibility, let's say in your role as a leader or um, in even in status power, and the vulnerabilities, particularly if we're confronted with our impact that we weren't intending, if our vulnerabilities eclipse our responsibility, meaning our responsibilities kind of get dropped or minimized and the vulnerability becomes the center, then we tend to act out of fragility or we tend to misuse our power. So there's a lot in there. I could do a whole other day's worth on that topic, but that's a key thing to be looking at in any relationship. What responsibilities and vulnerabilities do you have, and what do I have in this relationship?
Okay, Amanda, we have a question.
Okay.
Where does informal power fit into all of this? And I wasn't
Mm.
sure on the definition, and Lorraine said if you had questions, you can ask. So,
Yes, I would love to know the definition of informal power. Can you say more about that? And I'm not sure if we can unmute Lorraine.
there you
Let's
go. Yep.
see.
Oh, there we go. So yeah, we were talking about this the other day, a bunch of people, and there was I'll just set the context and I'll try to be quick about it. There was a bunch of people meeting, and because this one person seemed to have so much knowledge in the subject matter, and everybody was conferring to this one person, and she did not want that to happen because it was supposed to be this collective discussion. But because she did have, and I wouldn't even say she was coming across intimidating, because she wasn't kind of just showing off with all this information, but they knew that she had so much information on this subject matter that the other group, or the group of individuals, were giving her the power, and they were refusing, if you like, to have any input because she had all this information. And I think we looked upon that as being like informal power.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah, we call that status power, right?
Okay.
There's a lot of knowledge or maybe some degrees or letters behind her name or, that knowledge is status power. And in the face of status power, whether it's wealth or knowledge or attention or social capital, um, that tends to not be made explicit. It's an implicit dynamic, which is why they call it informal. Um, but it's still very much influencing the relationships and what's happening in the room. So I always say, can we name what's happening in the room? So if I have that knowledge and if I were the person that had that knowledge and I'm noticing this happening, I could say, hey, what I'm noticing is that everyone is looking to me, and I recognize that I have a lot of knowledge about this subject. And also, each one of you have wisdom about this. And the point of this collective is for us to each
Yes.
share our wisdom. And so that's a way to point to their personal power. And it's
Yeah.
also their responsibility, right?
Well,
That we want to share.
yeah. And one last thing, because I love that, and I think that was the answer. That was the only way. But she said, I felt stuck. And then when we talked about it, all of those other people apparently felt stuck in a different way also, right? Because of what was going on. So yeah, thank you for that, Amanda. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah, we're reluctant to name the relational dynamics in the room, but it really is the only way to get unstuck, to make it visible what's happening. And it's awkward, but we have to get used, like it's needs to become a new norm, and that's my biased perspective. But
Hey, Amanda, you ready for this one?
yeah, ready.
In an organizational context, how do you/we help folks see beyond hierarchical power and assume some personal power in right relationship, up, down, sideways, throughout, without putting it all on their shoulders or subject to harm, aka getting over skepticism or feelings of powerlessness in managing up, term they don't like.
Well, I love this question because it honors their own personal power. So I'm appreciating that there is that recognition because that doesn't often happen in a power differential. We kind of tend to defer because that's how we've been socialized. So when you are what we call down power in relationship to someone who's like up role power from you or up status power from you, it is risky business because you have vulnerability, right? You have more vulnerability than responsibility when you are down power in a power differential. So you have to first weigh what are the vulnerabilities here for myself if I am trying to manage up or to change the dynamic here. That's a very real and important evaluation that you must do because, again, the martyr thing can happen. The next thing I would do is engage collective power. If there are other people who are experiencing similar things with the up power person, can you go as a collective to the up power person or the up power people even? So assessing the vulnerability, but also understanding that when we are down power, it doesn't mean no power because you have personal power. So it's not to say that if there's no one else where you can find collective power, that you shouldn't say anything. I would just be very mindful in how you do that. And remembering the generative conflict principle that there's no right or wrong. I feel like I'm missing some of the nuance. Can you
I'm
help,
wondering,
Leah?
Amanda, I just want to add to, I think from my perspective, and I would love if Erin wants to chip in, but that they're also asking how you, if you're in a position with more power, help others step into their personal power. Would that be right, Erin?
Well, Erin, you can jump in if that's not the case, but when we are up power, when we have role or status or status power, we can invite, similar to what I demonstrated in Lorraine's example, we can invite conversation by naming the power dynamics and what commonly happens, right? So I notice when I say something, no one pitches in their ideas. And I really want a collaborative team environment. So here's what I'm going to do. In every staff meeting, we're going to have an idea brainstorming session, or we're going to have a feedback session, or we're going to have a structure in which you can submit anonymous feedback. When you are up power, you can create mini structures that allow, whether it's within a conversation or within a team or within an organization, you get to change policy. You get to challenge policy. You get to help shift the norms, or in other words, the systemic power. And there are certain ways in which systemic power can get shaped that allows people to access their personal power more. And depending on the leadership, that may be favorable to them or not. But if you're truly trying to build an empowered culture, a culture that is truly collective, you have to build it within the structures.
So those are great questions. And first of all, can people hear me now? Apparently my mic was turned down a little bit, so I've turned it up. I thought maybe we would take just a really quick break. Not really a break, just Jeff wants to share some things before you all hop off for your 1 o'clock. I know we already lost Shannon, and that was a little trigger for me to be like, oh, make sure I put these resources into the chat before we go. So I was just going to share a slide quickly about next action steps for you. If you're new to the right use of power, I've got some links to check out both the book and some upcoming trainings. I can't recommend training enough through the Right Use of Power Institute. The basics training, I think everyone should take, and probably the core training too. I think we should all just get more literate around power, just for ourselves in relationships. To be honest, my role as husband and father is influenced quite a bit, as well as my work as a leader in the world. So I'm going to pull up some slides. The first thing, though, I'm going to put in the chat is to go check out the Right Use of Power on LinkedIn. While I pull up my slides, go follow along, and you can hold there. But ways that you can move into action here after this webinar, definitely grab a copy of the book. And so we'll throw a link into the chat, take you right to Amanda's website, and you can order a book through there, or I'm sure where books are sold. It's probably one of those things you can order it from a variety of places. So definitely check that out. Definitely join the next basics training. I believe they happen monthly, and I believe the next one is April 8th. And so I'll put a link into the chat here once I stop sharing my slides to both the book as well as to the Right Use of Power event page, where you can sign up for webinars like this, and you can sign up for the basics or the core training. So I've got several people here that are members of the Co, which is at the Ally Co, our membership community for impact conscious leaders. And so we come together weekly, a couple times a month. And we've also got a digital community that you can join that has a bunch of resources and tools really around how do we embrace a power conscious leadership practice as people. So it's a peer-driven community where we do some facilitation and some hosting. I'll drop the link to that here in a second. But if you want to join us for a session, that's probably the best way to to engage with us. That QR code takes you right to a page where you can just sign up for one of our next upcoming sessions. We do 2 a month that are the second and fourth Thursdays. One is a communication hour where we talk about power conscious communication, and the other is a power mapping hour where we actually dig in with a tool and we start to map out the power dynamics that we're a part of. And lots of people bring, a stuckness that they're experiencing with a colleague or a team member. Or I usually use my 11-year-old daughter, Susie, as an example of like, how do you map out the power dynamic with a kid that's different than the boys? So that QR code, if you want to grab your phone, and that'll take you right there, but you can get to it from some links that I'll put into the chat as well. Last but not least, if you're in the Calgary area, I realize that lots of you aren't, you're kind of scattered around, but we do have a designing and facilitating high impact meetings. Myself and Nick Etheridge Calder, who's a team coach, are doing something at a brewery, which is a really fun thing. So an afternoon at a brewery, talking about designing and facilitating meetings through a power conscious perspective. So would love to see you there if you are in the area. And we also offer this one virtually as well. So if you're interested, just reach out via LinkedIn or email. That's all I've got. I'm going to check the chat, and I'm going to pass it back over to Amanda and Leah. If there's anything popping up, any other questions that we want to engage in, or Amanda, anything you want to really touch on in the last 10 minutes or so of our time.
Yeah, I saw in the chat, someone wanted to know about, so I'm doing a book and training tour in different places in the world. And so if you're interested in hosting in your area, or if you want to come to one of the in-person trainings, in-person training is so different because we get it. A lot of our work is very somatic. And so we get to do different kinds of exercises than we can do actually online. So we have registration and specific dates coming up soon, but these are kind of general, if you want to kind of take note, that are happening so far. The Bay Area, we're not quite sure which month it's falling in, but sometime in the fall. And by the fall, I mean August through December, because that's not the fall. I'm in the United States, so Yeah, I'll be in Spain. I think someone asked about the UK specifically. I think Spain and the UK in September. Um, I think we're trying to coordinate something in London. So, um, yeah, happy to take any remaining questions.
I have a question, and because I've got a list of them here, but I'm curious around any personal practices that have evolved for you around staying in touch, staying rooted in your power, maybe is the
Yeah.
language, or, what do you do to maintain that connection, stay in right relationship? Any personal practices that you found particularly helpful or that have evolved as you wrote the book or that you've been on this journey with power?
Yeah. Those are constantly evolving for me, those practices or rituals, as I call them. And one of them is just simply posture. Like even how you're sitting in your chair. For me, I notice that when I'm kind of doing this, I'm kind of collapsed and I'm not as connected or aligned. So even if you put your finger underneath your breastbone and push up, there's just a upliftedness that happens, and for me it's just a subtle reminder, like it feels more expansive and it feels more physically aligned, but also it's a reminder for me to be aligned in my values. There was also research done around, and I got this from the book, I think it's called The Science of Belonging by Jeffrey Cohen. But uh, he mentioned that they did studies around people who reflect on their core values before interacting with other people versus those who didn't. And the results were quite interesting. So I've also begun a practice of just, if you haven't identified your core values, I highly recommend that, and have some kind of practice of connecting with those every day. So whether you read them out loud for yourself, that's one that I've started to do, or however you do that. I also have some spiritual practices. I'm an animist, and I go out in the wilderness and fast for 4 or 5 days every year. It just helps me unplug from systems and helps me reroute in myself and remind me about my interconnection and my inherent belongingness. So those are a few that I do.
I'm wondering what I can do when I'm holding role power as a facilitator in a group and someone in the group has low status, trauma, and finally feels safe enough in the container to speak about their distress about something. But it starts to take up a lot of time, and I'm sensing that people are giving signs they want to move on. What have you done in those moments?
It's such a tender moment. You're in a double bind there, right? Because you are experiencing disconnection and harm in some ways. And I think in many in modernity, I'll just say, we don't leave time for attending to relationship itself, whether it's with our, partner or spouse or, intimate relationships or our work relationships. Um, it's the failure to attend to the in between, which is actually the glue. And if we're not taking time for that, then when the glue starts to disintegrate, then the organization or the partnership or whatever starts to disintegrate. I know how painful that is. For me, my kids are quite fed up with me talking about power all the time, but I use my role power as a parent to create structures so they can talk about it, right? I just talk about it. I talk about what's happening in the room. I talk about the needs that I have. And I've gotten to the point now, in certain situations, I can't get out of relationship, but I've gotten to the point now where I've stopped investing in relationships where there's no room to tend to the relationship or to have feedback conversations. If there's not a willingness to have that conversation, I'm not willing to invest in the relationship because it means that ultimately the health of that relationship isn't possible. I've just I'm 45 now, almost 46, and I'm like, I'm done with trying to convince people. Yeah.
I see some amens and some lots of love in the chat, and so thank you for that. And we've got a couple of minutes. Got some questions about the recording. Yes, we will make sure that we send out the recording as long as I have your email address. So if you've registered via LinkedIn or Eventbrite or through the Co, I have access to you, and so we'll be posting this recording in the Co for members. But I'll make sure a recorded version gets shipped out to everyone who signed up today. Lindsay would like you to come a little bit north of Calgary. How north are we talking, Lindsay? Are we talking Edmonton? Are we talking? So I know Edmonton was tossed around a little bit for the upcoming
That's
dates.
right. Edmonton is what I was thinking. So 3 hours north.
Okay. Yeah, well,
I'll also put my scheduling link in the chat if you're interested in like hosting along the tour, or if you're interested in bringing right use of power to your organization, or you just want to chat about the book. I'm happy. It's my favorite subject, so happy to talk about it. Well, I hope to see you all in one form or another. We try to offer free sessions. I know that just for everyone right now, people are struggling financially, so please don't let that be a barrier. We want to make things as accessible as possible. So if you have interest, please reach out. I can also put my email in the chat if you don't want to schedule with me. There we go. Thank you so much for inviting me, Jeff. I really appreciate it. And Leah is one of our faculty members. So she's actually teaching, co-teaching with me in the next basics in April. So hope to see some of you there.
For that in the chat. So
Wonderful.
Join us, Stu.
Awesome. Thank you both, Amanda and Leah, for coming out and sharing your time and your wisdom. And hopefully everyone here got something of value, and you can take that forward. And, I really do nudge you towards the right use of power as a framework and a model and a set of tools for being in right relationship with people in your life and yourself. So thank you. I'm happy to stick around as well. If anyone wants to chat, we'll stay on the line. But also it's 2 minutes to the hour. And so if you have to hop off, by all means. So thank you.
Bye, y'all. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.